All right, now you had a video?
Okay, yeah. So mine's a little bit on the more serious tip, but go ahead if you want to start that video and we'll
This
talk
is on
about
the
it.
more serious tip.
Yeah,
You're not giving
Yeah.
us just the. Never mind.
Yeah.
You want me to just play?
yeah. Go ahead.
All right. Here we go.
An Airbnb tenant is refusing to leave after overstaying her welcome at a luxurious guest home in LA unless she gets paid $100,000. Elizabeth Hirschhorn booked a long-term stay at Dr. Sasha Jovanovich's guest house in September of 2021 until the spring, bringing her rent total to over $20,000. But since April 2022, she's still been living at the home rent-free and refuses to leave unless she gets her requested six-figure relocation fee from Jovanovich, according to the LA Times. Though Jovanovich has been trying to evict her and has sought help from the city and lawyers, it's not that simple. Hirschhorn had reached out to the Department of Buildings and Safety, which found violations, an unpermitted shower, and that the unit was not approved for occupancy. After she sent these to the city's housing investigator, the investigator reportedly concluded that Jovanovich had to withdraw his eviction notice until the unit was in compliance, since its current status violated city codes. But according to the LA Times, Jovanovich also alleges that Hirschhorn blocked him from accessing the home to retrieve necessary permits and to make repairs. And because Hirschhorn had stayed in the home for over 6 months, the outlet points out that she qualifies for LA's Just Cause Ordinance, which basically states the landlord is required to pay for relocation assistance if there are no legal grounds for eviction. That is where Hirschhorn's request for $100,000 comes in. For more on this story, head to dailymail.com.
Okay, so
Okay. First of all, that was a beautiful home.
yeah, it was really nice. Yeah, and I could see why you would want to rent some of that out at as an Airbnb. Very nice. And I don't know if that gentleman has a family, probably, because it couldn't be just one person, like just himself. He was a single person staying there. But either way, whether it is or not, man, it's a nice home, and kind of you don't usually.
This whole thing kind of like pisses me off.
Yeah.
I mean, I get like tenants' rights.
Mm-hmm.
You want to protect them so that some big corporation or something doesn't just steamroll them and take away their home. That's not cool.
Right.
But at the same time, there are some just people just renting out their home that maybe don't have that much.
Yeah.
Like the part that's hitting me is I used to rent out I had a condo that I bought when I was young. And then later on, I was living with somebody and we needed a little bit more space because I had a very small condo to begin with.
Yeah.
And I didn't have a ton of money, but I was able to get enough to buy the second place.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked to some friends and some people that did rentals, and they were like, "You should just rent the first place out, and instead of selling it." And then, it was still kind of like a paycheck to paycheck though, because they would give me the rent, and then I would pay the mortgage with it. And if somebody did something like that to me, I would be totally screwed.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a lot of people who think that, whether they're renting from a rental company or an individual, that that them paying the rent is not a big deal. Like basically it's just them paying money, to whatever entity, whether they, and I think it's always assumed that the company or the person has the money already. So it's not a big deal.
Like as if you're giving them something extra
Right,
that
exactly.
they don't really need.
Right.
And you really need to live there.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and it could be very frustrating. Like, I mean, I hate to admit it, but I was in that position as a tenant where my rent was late, a couple of times, and I try to explain that situation before it's going to be late or whatever, just so my landlord or the apartment complex would know. But yeah, I mean, I feel like that's kind of a general consensus. Is it almost feels like renters feel like they're kind of doing those people a favor.
For me, I had a renter that paid late several times, and after the third time, I was like, "Hey, man, I get sometimes it's difficult, but let me tell you the situation we're in. I take your money and I pay to the bank. If you don't give me your money, I can't pay the bank. I miss 2 or 3 payments, they might try to take it away from me, and then we both lose it.
Right,
and then it's completely out of my hands.
Yeah, and then Yeah, I mean, I think I just said that too. It's like, which I don't know if maybe telling tenants that would make a difference, because maybe if they see the whole picture, maybe even if it's not ahead of time, maybe, if they make a few late payments and then, you're like, hey, listen, these late payments are not just, affecting you or whatever, that it's a bigger picture here.
And to be honest, and it's almost like when you let somebody borrow money, at least that's what's happening in my head.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I were to loan somebody money and they're like, oh, I'll pay you back later. And then they don't, but I see them with a bunch of new things. I think, what are you doing?
Yeah.
That's kind of like I would go like knock on their door to talk to them. And sometimes they'd invite me in. Sometimes we just talk from the hallway. I always saw all these new things. They were always talking about vacations and stuff. And I'm like, keep playing with me and the bank's going to take this away from us. And then nobody gets anything. I just wasn't in the position to pay for 2 mortgages. I actually had to rent it. And I don't know. I was hoping it would be one of those scenarios where, somebody else needs a place to stay. I have an extra place and I can build equity over a long term. So maybe have some money to retire on. It wasn't like I was using the money to buy like a private jet or a boat or something. The thing actually made me I think it made me $50 a month, but it built equity. So I don't own that property anymore. I've hence sold it. And then at that point it was worth thousands of dollars to me. So,
yeah. So I don't know. I mean, this situation is pretty tough too, because, they said in there, one thing that just caught my attention was that there was some renovations that were done that were not up to code or didn't have proper permitting. But you would think that in that case, that would be more reason to tell the person to leave, because they're like, these things were done, it's not up to code. Like, for what all we know is that you're in an unsafe situation. So at the very least, maybe the tenant doesn't have to pay anything. But they just have to leave like right away or something.
Yeah, this feels like a scam artist that's using the system to get free stuff.
Right.
Like, what did it say that they have to pay $100,000 to relocate her? So it sounds like she wants the relocation. And the other thing is how many millions of dollars is that house worth? That thing was insane. I don't know her personal situation, but if it was like I don't know, if it was a more normal house, I would be like, well, these are just normal people hitting hard times or something like that.
Right.
But to see that, I'm thinking, well, wait a second.
Yeah.
There was one, I saw this online and now I wish I had it to show, but it was a scenario where, again, they had squatters. People just, the building was empty and they were planning on doing some renovations. And then I don't know if they were going to rent it out or what, but squatters moved in while it was empty. And in certain places, you can't just get rid of them. You can't just open the door and go get out.
Right.
So they found, just like these squatters found a loophole into taking the house, they found a loophole. And I wish I knew where this was, but basically, if there was an active lease, the law had to enforce whatever the active lease was. And so this woman owned the place and she gave an active lease to her son and they signed it and everything. It was all legal. And then one day when the squatters went to like the grocery store, the son ran in there, changed all the locks and put up all these cameras and then called the police. And then when the police showed up, the squatters came back and they're like, this is my active lease.
Oh, wow.
And they're like, we need you to get out of here right now. And then the police were basically like, well, do you have anything inside? And the guy opened the door and let them come in to get their stuff. But at this point, the police were like, well, he's the legal tenant. So he's the one that we need to protect.
Yeah.
And I was like, what a weird loophole.
Yeah, that really is. Yeah, there's another case that's kind of similar to this where there's a guy who, and I don't have the location, but he's basically like living in his van outside of his house while squatters live inside the house. And
I heard about this.
Yeah,
Didn't he start as like was it like an Airbnb thing?
Yeah.
And he was like, oh, maybe I can save up a little bit of money.
The crazy part about this one is that squatters or whatever that are living in the house are renting out some of the house for money. Like, oh, it's just so crazy. And like, I don't know how any of that is anyway legal, that somebody can't just be like, you need to go.
Yeah. I mean, I understand why we have laws to protect tenants, but some of this stuff, there feels like there's some pretty big loopholes.
Yeah.
And it feels like you're being taken for a scam, and they're playing the system. And I mean, that one in particular, the guy was saying how he didn't have a lot of money, and he came up with this idea. It wasn't something like in the summer, he was going to live in his van, make a little extra cash, have some savings, and then he gets screwed.
Yeah.
That's just so ridiculous.
Yeah. So if anybody's out there thinking of, open your home up to renters or as an Airbnb, just be careful out there and make sure that you have the proper documentation and everything.
Well, I think even when you do have that, sometimes they just refuse to leave.
Yeah.
And then in certain areas you can't. There has to. I remember where I was. I was in Chicago when I had my rentals. I had 2 of them, and I remember talking to an attorney like, well, what happens if somebody doesn't, what happens if this all goes sideways and I have to, evict somebody?
Yeah.
And they basically told me, well, you start out with filing all this paperwork, and then there's like a waiting period. And I think the waiting period at the time was like 90 days. And then then the sheriff can come and evict them. There's all these notices and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand some of it, but I don't know, the things we're talking about right now, I just feel like you show up for an Airbnb and then you just decide not to leave, and then you demand $100,000.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's an Airbnb.
Yeah. It's crazy.